Welcome to M&A Plus, the art after the deal, where we explore what happens after the ink dries and how real value gets created. I'm your host, Lisa Scott. Today's guest is someone who's not only guided billion-dollar companies through strategic growth, but also helped shape how boards and leadership teams navigate complexity. I'm joined by Tom Doorley, founder of Sage Partners, co-founder of Braxton Associates, and a trusted advisor to top firms and boards across the country. From scaling startups to integrating with global firms like Deloitte, Tom brings deep insights into how strategy and governance converge to create sustainable value after the deal. We'll explore the decision-ready board concept, the difference between growth and value-creating growth, and leadership lessons for navigating polarized organizations and post-M&A challenges. Welcome to the show, Tom. I'm really glad to have you on.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So tell us a little bit about your background, kind of how, where you started and how you got into the M&A field. I know the M&A field is broad and, there isn't really a major in college for it, but kind of what was your journey like?
So I come out of Columbia with my MBA, figured I'd do something traditional. And I nailed it down because I was a marketing major to going to a consumer marketing piece, which was Procter & Gamble, or industrial marketing, which is 3M. All of a sudden, a fellow from a consulting firm that was great then, unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, called Arthur D. Little, came by and said, "Hey, why don't you try this?" I turned out I did. I loved it, and I've stayed with it forever. But one of the things that happened is that I began to focus on how companies grow organically, and also increasingly grow by finding places that they could expand by acquisition. And so I started off early on helping my clients find acquisitions, and I was on the buy side. And I sorted out why this particular company or that particular company would make sense, and then I helped them evaluate. Oddly enough, partway through the situation at Arthur D. Little, I realized that Arthur D. Little was on a wrong path, and I needed to find something else to do. I liked being a consultant, so a friend and I set up something called Braxton Associates, a strategy consulting firm, and away we went. We were in our 30s then, and probably you say, "Whoa, why did you do that?" And I just felt that I was young enough that if I tripped up, I could recover, but that I wasn't going to be able to see a long-term healthy prospect at Arthur D. Little. And away we went, and we began to do it. Then it turned out that this is one of those business school teachings that business schools talk about the chasm. How do you cross the chasm from being a young, small, fast-growing company to being a more stable, large-growing company? We looked around and said, you know what? We got 2 offices, Boston, London. We're doing really well, growing fast, 20-some% per year. But there's some bad bandits out there, not just McKinsey, but BCG and Bain. What are we going to do? So we needed to find a partner. And so we sorted out a number of folks and ended up doing what I think was, and I'll say this in all modesty, without much humility, that we did a brilliant merger with what became Deloitte Consulting's strategy practice. And the great thing about it, I learned how to think about the things that happen on what we call day 2. Day 1 is the close. You have a party, you celebrate and all that. But day 2 is the big one. Oh my God. Now we're no longer in charge of our own destiny. We have to integrate and we have to negotiate and all that sort of thing. And I learned an awful lot. So I bring experiences, and we do in our firm, from the buy side and the sell side, and both of which are relevant to this important topic of what happens once you find a good deal. How do you create the value that you said you were going to get when you presented the deal thesis to the investment committee?
Right. So let's start with some details around that. So I know that you have some expertise in the board, and I was really interested. I've never explored that topic before. So I was really interested in talking a little bit about that. You talk about a decision-ready board post-deal. So what does that mean?
Yeah, well, first of all, the decision-ready concept says that a board is an expensive asset. It costs a lot of money to keep a board together. You spend a lot of time working with the board. You ought to get a return on that board. In order to get a return, management has to invest in the board, not just in terms of fees and lunches and all that sort of thing, but in terms of allowing them to be decision ready. That is, giving them enough information so that when something happens, they can contribute to decision making. They're not the decision makers, but they contribute to decision making right away and effectively. And that's difficult because most of the time the CEOs and the C-suite are burdened down with other things, and the board is sort of this thing. And it
Mhm.
becomes a compliance issue, but that's not the right way to do it. Post-deal, the board can be very, very effective because if they're decision ready, they know why it is we did the deal, and they can be part of the process that says that let's do a little evaluation after the fact to see how this is working. Two reasons for that. One, if it's not working, we can make some corrections, right? But secondly, if we are careful about saying, what did we learn from this deal? The next one we do, we're going to do it better.
Mhm.
And the idea is that a board can be above the fray, sort of in the mix of the day-to-day stuff, and can have this overall perspective of taking a look at whether it's working and why and what we've learned from
Mhm.
it.
Right. Kind of like a outside consulting firm a little bit.
Well, yeah,
So
yes, they do. They do hire us to do the same thing, by the way,
right.
which we enjoy. Yes.
I- So tell me a little bit more about like what's the ideal way that a board is set up? Like who's on the board and how often do they make contributions or how do they make those contributions?
First of all, you don't want the board to be too big. We had a board that was 16, 17 people. We convinced them there was just too many people because you can't really communicate effectively, make a decision ready if you have that many people. So the optimal number depends on what the size is. If you're a smaller company, maybe 5. If you're a larger company, maybe no more than 9, possibly 11 at the outside. You have an agenda that you follow all the time, and you set that out, and here are the things we're going to talk about. But importantly, you always have some time during the course of the board meetings where you turn off the machines, you get rid of the note taker, the secretary, and you ask the CEO as a board, now, what's on your mind? What concerns you? And they get to
Mm.
think freely. So this is something that doesn't need to take any action, but is important things that say, worried about this, it may or may not happen, I'll keep it on the radar. And those kinds are important. And the way in which you engage the board is you work with them in between the times that the board is in session. So you communicate with them, you meet with them, you send them notes, you give them information. In fact, you bring them into events that you're holding at the companies. So it is a matter of a balance. The board is not running the show, management is, but the board needs to know enough so that they can really contribute. And what types of things
Mhm.
they contribute on? They contribute on the big things. Management succession is one of those things. But another one is when you're sort of trying to make a big move, sort of into a new market or an acquisition, natural time to have your board front and center.
So let's talk a little bit about the mindset that you talk about in some of your posts I saw on
Yeah,
LinkedIn. So you talk about a growth centric mindset and
yeah,
you're sort of distinguishing, growth versus just, an acquisition versus a growth acquisition.
sure.
And what does
Yeah,
that
so
mindset look like?
sure. The concept of growth mindset is that you need to keep this upfront all the time. Years ago, and we had a client who was a great client called Corning, and Corning is in a single business, but it's branched out. And as they were sort of working through how to reignite growth because they had kind of slowed down, they had a concept called growing Corning. And every place you went into, a field sales office or an operating facility, there was something right at the beginning. Growing Corning, here's what we were doing. And it meant to say that all the time we're thinking about this, all the time we're worried about it. And this is particularly important when you get into times of confusion or crisis, because management has to obviously, in a time of crisis like the financial meltdown in 2008 or even during COVID, has to say, we have to make sure that we manage the base. We have to keep the things in order, keep the trains running on the time. At the same time, they have to also be taking growth-oriented initiatives, which
Mhm.
require risk. Now, these are two almost opposite things, and it's a difficult task, but it's what leaders do. You need to have the ability to say, no matter what, yes, we're going to worry about the costs, we're going to constrain ourselves, but we're still going to keep growth initiatives going all the time, not just
Mhm.
part-time.
Right. Could you give us an example of, a story that contrasts growth gone wrong versus growth done right?
Ooh, growth gone wrong. Yeah, I'll give you a story. This goes back in history. Major client of mine and ours was Kimberly-Clark. And Kimberly-Clark had some new technology in the diaper business, and they needed to decide whether they should invest in it or not because the big guy was Procter& Gamble. And Procter& Gamble over the previous decade had just hammered. So we helped them find a way to do it. They launched it, and away they went and did a great job. They won. They got ahead of the game. They invested faster and more in the new technology. Procter & Gamble was slow, and so they were able to establish themselves as the leader in the premium segment, which was their product is called Huggies. The product that P&G had was called Love's, doesn't exist anymore. So because they established that premium product, it created a halo over their other products. They could price Kleenex at more than the comparable products for the other people. And that was positive. That was growth, created incredible hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe even just about $1.5 billion of shareholder value, hired lots of people, did great work for lots of people using the product. Then, this is, by the way, after that we had gone on to work with other companies and all that, they had a chance to buy a commodity business, Scott Paper. It was a huge mistake. Scott Paper was a down market product, different system, and they had not been investing in brand building for the last 5 or 6 years, so they could bottom at a bargain, right? It cost Kimberly-Clark a lot of money to try to fix it. They never did fix it. They still produce Scott products, but they're not profitable. So there was an idea that said, "Gee whiz, what's wrong with this?" Right? We're in the same business, roughly speaking, the tissue business, but it ran against the grain of how they'd been successful selling a premium brand. Of basic products, but a premium brand, getting a premium price, and it was a mistake, and unfortunately, it has hurt the company deeply.
Okay, that's interesting. The Kleenex example is interesting. They must have had good branding because Kleenex is basically synonymous with tissue now.
Yes, it is. And by the way, so we were working with the R&D group, and they had a new product that they called Killer Kleenex. And what it was Kleenex that had a coating on it that would help you not get viruses and other bacteria on it. But they couldn't sell it because, well, first of all, they're going to change the name. They didn't call it Killer Kleenex. That was a cute name. To pay an extra 30%, now 40%, along comes COVID. And you see on the shelves now their viral brand, and it's exploded. So there was a great product, right, that had to wait for its time. And it was and it was a great it is a great product. I buy it a lot, and it's a good thing. But it was a good product, wrong time, but they didn't get rid of it, which is a good thing.
So you talk a lot about the fog of change.
Yes.
And I know that you have a podcast about that, which is a very good compliment actually to my podcast.
Yes,
I'm definitely going to listen
yes,
to
it
it.
is. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, how do you shift an executive team into a growth mindset if they are not already in a growth mindset?
Yeah. Well, first of all, which is anytime you're going to make a change, whether it's what we're talking about is the fog of change or moving to more of a growth mindset, you have to have a predicate. You have to have a reason why we want to change. People don't want to change. Change is hard, frankly. And so you have to have a serious reason. Now, crisis like COVID or the global meltdown, that triggers change in everybody's mind because you simply have to. But the question is, how do you get people to understand that we're leaving value on the table? We're missing opportunity by not growing. So the first thing we do with the client is help them make the case. We look at where their successful products are and how those products are working, and those products are creating most of the value. The companies that grow products, the companies that grow services, create enormous value. And so we did, and I wrote a book years ago called Value Creating Growth, where we analyzed thousands of companies, domestically and internationally, and we split them into two big categories, the fast growers and the slow growers. The fast growers created value over 3 to 5 years, total shareholder value, seven times the slow growers. So that's in a general sense. You present that to them, and then you look at their own products and say, this one has taken off, and look what it's done for you. So you have to simply make the case at the beginning. Otherwise, people won't take it seriously. They'll give you lip service, but it won't have the impact as needed.
Right. Oh, okay. That's good. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle advisory, startup to exit. So I know that you were involved in scaling Braxton Associates, which integrated with Deloitte. Is that correct?
Yep.
So
yes,
I just wanted to kind of understand what are some of the common challenges you see, because we have like a smaller entity integrating with a very large company that's used to doing things their own way all the time. Can you just give us a flavor for how that experience was and how you did it?
Sure. And we had a lot of help when we chose the partner we wanted to work with. we really love the people on the other side of the table. So it's very important to say we can relate to these people.
Mm-hmm.
They understand our culture. We understand their culture, and we think we can work with them. So that's really important. But probably the central thing it is saying that we have to understand that as Braxton, we were pretty independent, right? Obviously, we had to do things to serve clients and all that sort of thing. But we had a lot of flexibility in terms of what it is we did. On the other side, day two, we're not going to have that. And this is something I tell all the companies that I'm selling. If you are the entrepreneur, if you got to understand, life is going to be different. And it's just, it changes. You have to deal with it. It's okay. We can work on it, but you simply have to understand it's not going to be the same way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is then you start working early on what it's going to, and we did this, what it's going to look like after the fact. Here's an example. What are we going to call this piece? We're going to call it Braxton Associates. We can still call it Braxton. Even though it was inside, another thing, we still call it Braxton. That was important because as a member of the management committee, so if I had to be a member of the management committee, on the first meeting, I walked into the room and one of the guys on the management committee said, well, what are you going to call this thing? And I said, I know, Braxton, because, right? And so simple things like that. And then I had some great advice from a fellow on the other side of the table, a fellow who was a pretty seasoned consultant. And he said, in order to understand culture, you don't want to just write down, here are the 5 principles, the things that are our vision of culture. What you want to do is you want to try to create some sort of little document that it says this. Here is how it is we do things around here. And then let's compare that to how the other guys do things around here and see where there are some issues. And that was incredibly valuable. So it was a tactical approach to this thing called culture. We set up, I said, branding. We set up all this. We set up how we were going to manage ourselves. I was a member of the management committee, that sort of thing. We organized all that beforehand. So you need to think about it. And then the important thing was we were able to sell ourselves in a positive way to the people who didn't know us. And that was one of my goals. My goal was to go out into the field and present who it is we are, what it is we were doing, and how together we could do great things. We obviously were a strategy piece. They didn't really have much of a strategy practice at all. And so in one sense, that was the type of thing you could deal with. But I had to say that it's not that we're better than you. We're different. And what we do is this. What you do is that. And boy, together, my gosh, can we serve the clients incredibly well. So we made the case. We made the case that we would be value added to them.
Good. So how big was Braxton when it was integrated into Deloitte? And did they keep all the people?
That is a really good question. I was proud of the fact that 10 years later, of our 10 senior most people, 8 of them stayed with us. And I was one of those, right? And then that's good. We were about 100 people. We were generating about $10 million in revenue at the time between Boston and London. And so we were, I don't know, a couple of percent the size of the other guys, right? But we had an outside impact because we had a story to tell. And that story sold well. And one of the things I also did, which was useful, the way a professional service firm works is that on your P&L, the hours that you charge to a client go with the person. So if I'm at Braxton and we use some people from Deloitte to do something for us, their P&L gets that information. And so the P&L is not a good representation of impact. So I created a little matrix that looked at the revenues that we generated as Braxton and the amount of revenues we generated for Deloitte people. And the numbers at first were about 5 or 6 to 1 in our favor. I mean, as we generate 5 to 6 more. Over time, those became 20 to 1 because we turned out to be the front end of a wedge where we would go in with strategy work and then it would require an awful lot of implementation work after the fact. Yeah.
Good. So last question on this section.
Sure.
Are there any repeatable practices that can accelerate growth through that startup to exit phase, throughout the life cycle of startup to exit?
Yeah, well, the first thing I tell all our young clients, and we have about a third of our revenues come from young companies. We have a portfolio of young companies, about 35, and so that's our group. But if I'm working with a very young company, the first thing I tell them is you should not be planning for an exit. You should be able to identify at some point, here are the types of companies that could be our natural acquirers. But you should be focused on building a company that works. And if a company is valuable, it works.
Mm-hmm.
You're serving the customers you want to serve with the technologies you want to serve and all that sort of thing. Everything will be
Mm-hmm.
fine. But if you start thinking about exit too soon, then you do things that, well, if we did this, well, that just might be attractive to somebody else.
Mm.
Then you're diminishing the base business. And a good acquirer can see through that. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one repeatable practice. Another one is to make sure that as you go along, you have confidence in yourself. So you're bringing new people in who are as good or even better and certainly have different skills than you have. That sounds easy, doesn't it? Isn't that pretty simple, right? You want good people
Mm-hmm.
around you, yes, but an awful lot of young company entrepreneurs think of themselves as the smartest person in the room. And as opposed to hiring other small people, they're I don't know, hesitant. And so they bring in people who are good, but not
Mm-hmm.
great. And that's a huge mistake. We had a client that was a young company client. They grew to about 100 people. And I observed that the CEO was just not hiring people who were good or better than he was. They never got past 100. Well, they maybe got to about 110. They would
Mm.
drop back to 90. And so they all bounced around 100. And that was a mistake. And they sub-optimized.
Okay, so let's talk about, leadership. Let's just talk about leadership topic. So this concept of organizational polarization.
Yeah,
And could you describe what that looks like and how to bridge those divides within that framework?
sure. Let me take it outside of the organizational and talk about it in a broader sense.
Sure.
That my undergraduate degree is from Penn State. I was an engineer, and there are two fellows at Penn State. One of them is John Silver, wrote a book of why do we disagree about inequality. That was fine, but the real thing they did, which I liked, was they created a concept that says that people with a different worldview can look at the same information, not disinformation, the same information, and come to different conclusions. If your worldview, let's look at immigration. If your worldview is a social justice worldview, then you say, oh my gosh, these people coming in are desperate. They're fleeing poverty, persecution, all that, so that we need them. We need to offer them a place to stand. If you're from the social order point of view, you say, I understand that, but you see, we're overwhelmed. Our infrastructure can't handle them. The housing doesn't work. The schools are overwhelmed. The hospitals are overwhelmed. Now, if you believe that each of those is a valid point of view, now you can have a conversation about, okay, what do we do about it?
Mm.
If you don't believe that those are valid points of view, then you're done, right? So within an organization, and this happens when companies are trying to think about making a new acquisition or others like that, you have to be able to say, in terms of why does Group A think that this is a good concept? Why does Group B think it's not? And there's a professor at Wharton School, Adam Grant, a psychology professor, and he uses the concept, says, when you make your case, you should make it strong, and you should make it forcefully, and you should make it as if you're right. However, when you listen to the other guy, you should listen as if you're wrong. So leadership needs to have that concept to say that if we are going to do the right things, grow, take risks, create value, we're going to have to be able to look at different issues. And somebody who initially might not support something might actually have a better idea. Maybe they're right. So we have to understand that and listen to that. And that's why it's really important to have an open dialogue as opposed to having people come up with the PowerPoint presentation. Because if you're good at doing that, you're a good debater, you can have a good story. So you want to have this conversation about why is this right or why is this not, from a perspective of respect the other person. Make your case as if you're right, listen as if you're wrong. Different worldviews can look at the same information and come to different conclusions, and that's okay.
If you had the ability to create like a leadership team, like you could talk about a high performance leadership team, how would you choose those people? And how would you process that in your mind on what a high performance team looks like and what the individuals that make up that team are like?
Yeah, one of the first things that I've learned over time is that because leadership is a team sport, it helps if the people you have on your leadership team have actually played a team sport. There's something happen when you're on a field of play. You go in with their structure, then all hell breaks loose. You have to react to it. And you have to anticipate your fellow players and all that sort of thing. And it's really, you have to be creative, you have to be responsive, you have to be agile. So I think that's one thing that I say is really important. In addition, you have to be able to have people who can grasp issues quickly, but also go deep. So get the essence of an issue quickly and then go deep. You have to also have them be, in a sense, willing to be collaborative, willing to share, realizing that they don't have all the good ideas. And finally, this is one I just picked up and that I pirated from the leader of an organization called Magid, which is a digital marketing organization. Her name is Kate Morgan. She's the COO. And she says one of the 5 things she does when she's looking for people to join her team, leaders, is she looks for kindness. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. But kindness is not softness. Because if you're running a team, you know that not everybody can make the team. And sometimes people don't perform and they have to be taken off the team, which is tough. But you should approach it with kindness or with compassion. And I find that's really critical. The final thing is that these are people who, even if you disagree with them, you have to be able to trust them. And occasionally I've had people in my organization I haven't trusted, and we've helped them move on. And that's really important, because if I'm going to be honest about what my concerns are and what we need to do, I have to be able to trust you.
Exactly. Yeah, it's important. All right. So let's talk about the playbook. I know I'm really into playbooks because my company, we provide services, and the playbook for us is really important. Planning is very important. Planning to us equals a more successful outcome. I know you might agree with that as well. So,
I do, yeah.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of a playbook and kind of how that fits and what your playbooks might look like.
Sure. So the first thing, it starts with what it is you want to do, the strategy itself. So strategy and planning are 2 different things. There's strategy, what we're going to do, and there's planning, which is how we're going to do it. And it's important to have a playbook like that. So let's apply it to M&A, right? And so one of the things we learned about in terms of M&A is that, frankly, our research and others say that maybe M&A is a coin flip, 50-50. And by that, when we've asked companies to say, how did this deal turn out? It's about, when you look at the deal thesis that you present to your investment committee, how many of those aspects did you actually hit? Did you actually nail? And about half the time they said we really got them, and the other half the time said we came up short on this, that, and the other thing. So that's an important thing to understand. Second thing to understand is that this is a learned competence. We've done research over time, and you find out that the companies that do more acquisitions, more mergers, have a higher rate of success than those who don't. It's a learned competence. And so you can do that by doing a lot of them yourself or by hiring folks who are experienced at it. So they can say here are the steps you go through. Having done that, you have to start planning early and often about what happens after closing, which I said earlier we call day 2. And again, in all the work we've done with clients and all, the front end gets the most emphasis. Is this the right company? And you look at their competitive position, you look at their earnings power, you look at their recurring revenues, you look at whether the customer's satisfaction is high and all that sort of thing. So those factors really work that hard, and that's important. But the sooner you start talking about what happens after the fact, the better it is. We had to deal with a smallish company called FabSuite who had a manufacturing technology. And we found a number of companies that were good for them. One of them was a company called Trimble, which is a large software company. And Trimble has this idea of transforming the way work is done. And so they seemed like a good fit. The reason we said they're the one we're going to focus on was they began talking about where FabSuite would sit, who they'd report to, who their mentors would be, before they actually submitted their first offer. That was a mic drop moment, and that's really important. Our CFO at Sage Partners is Dave Rosenblum. Dave, the last thing he did at Deloitte Consulting before he joined us was he ran the practice of finding mergers, acquisitions for Deloitte Consulting. He did 9 of them. 8 of them were spectacular successes. The one that wasn't was small. And one of the big things he did, which is something we've adopted, is that once you get through the first part of it, this looks like a good company. Now you're starting to get into due diligence. He put as many people on the post-acquisition, the post-merger planning, that transition period, as he did on the front end. Nobody does that. And that was brilliant. And that means that once you have the thing in place, day 2, it's going to go smoothly. So our playbook is organized around that, not just the front end, but also the things that happen after the fact, because that's critically important for releasing value.
Right. So I'm going to go a little bit more in the weeds. Hopefully it's not too
Yeah,
far in the weeds, but I
that's
work a
okay.
lot in the weeds, so I'm used to the weeds.
Weeds are
So we
good.
work,
Weeds are good. Yeah.
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 So we work a lot with contracts specifically and transitioning contracts. When I say contract, I mean commercial contracts, like with
Uh,
customers or with vendors. The
yes.
vendor space is often a very large space that not only has contracts and the need for contract review, and there's a lot of volume, but there's also this issue of during a transition, during that fog of change, where you need processes and mechanisms for new entities to be able to pay the vendors. Things that are people think maybe they take it for granted, but it's actually something that somebody needs to set it up. So
Sure
that's
enough.
my
Yeah.
company's involved in that. But I wanted to kind of get your take on some of those operational challenges that you've experienced, especially as it relates to contracts or legal review or contracts management, or even managing the relationships with the suppliers or vendors. What kind of experience do you have in that space, and what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. This can be a challenge because you're changing from one person having the interaction or whatever to another person or at least another organization. So it's very careful to understand before, as you go into that, what are the five things that are really important? Because in the contract, as you know, as you talk about the weeds, contracts unfortunately have gone from 2 pages to a lot more than 2 pages. So there's a lot of weeds. So you need to understand at the beginning, here are the five most important things and see if those five most important things are covered in the new agreement.
Mm-hmm.
You then have to set up the way in which the communication is going to happen. Who gets to row in and say, well, wait a minute, we got something wrong. Who's going to do something different? And it's really important to have the technology meshed. One of the things that always
Mm-hmm.
happens is, right, my technology and your technology, well, they don't exactly fit neatly. So it's really important to make sure that the technology is meshed so you can pay the bills, you can keep track of the invoices, and all that
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. So those are critical things. But I say the first thing is that, what I mentioned first is to isolate the things that are going to make it successful and make sure that in the new contract, the revised contract, those things make it successful because I love lawyers and we have a lawyer and some of my
Mm-hmm.
good friends are lawyers, but lawyers tend to want to make things complex.
Complex.
And
Okay. Mm-hmm.
yeah, because, naturally, the more complex it is, it's like when you have somebody landscape your house, right?
Mm-hmm.
They get paid by the tree. So they want to put in more trees as opposed to fewer trees. And you just
Mm-hmm.
have to guard against that.
Right. Exactly. Um, Good. So, is there anything else that you would like to tell my audience? I have a final question, but I'll do that last. So, um,
Well,
d-
maybe I'll step on your final question.
right.
But I'm launching a new podcast, a series. It's in our basic podcast, but it's focused on this idea of the fog of change, and it's making the case that we've entered an unusual period here, where all of a sudden change, and some change is normal. This is almost overwhelming. From the technology perspective, AI, quantum computing,
Mm-hmm.
synthetic biology, enormous. Geopolitical, locally or not locally, but in our nation, we've gone from one sort of management or political structure, global progressivism perhaps, to, I don't know, local populism. And on the global stage, China's coming on with a force, and Russia, even as diminishing, is being disruptive, and new issues are forming in the Middle East. And finally, social media has scaled. And social media, all of a sudden, fringe voices can have enormous impact. So you need to find a way to deal with that. And our proposal for how to deal with that is what we call the Leaders Change Agenda. We're going to be unfolding this to help
Mm.
companies navigate the fog of change, because almost everybody I talk to, including people who are, outside of our client base, are saying, good Lord, what is going to happen here, right? Is
Right. Well, it
AI
makes
going to
it hard to
displace
plan,
every?
right?
Oh, man, it does. Yeah. Yeah. Not impossible, but hard. Yes. Yeah.
Good. So, last question. So, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about how boardrooms work, what would you change?
Ah, I would say that how boardrooms work, the thing I would change is that they need to have commitment. Years ago, you would find people who sat on 5, 6, or 7 boards. That's too
Hmm.
many. You can't be a contributor. So you need to understand that if you're on a serious board, I mean a board of some scale, as opposed to some, not for profit that's small and all that doesn't take up much of your time. You have to allocate the time to it.
Mm.
Maybe over time, a day a week or more. I give an example. So I mentioned I was a graduate of Penn State. Penn State years ago had a blow up. A football coach named Jerry Sandusky was implicated in doing things he shouldn't have been doing with small kids, and it was a terrible blow up. I happened to be advising the lawyer that was brought onto the board to help them figure out what to do, the board of trustees, which, by the way, had 30-some people on it, which, of course, as I said earlier, is way too many. As I sat in on one of those board meetings, one of the board members said, "Gee whiz, man, this is a lot more trouble than I thought it would be. I didn't want to give this much time to it." Bingo.
Mm-hmm.
That person should not be on the board of trustees. And it is so. If there's one thing I could change, is an understanding coming in that if you're going to be on this board, you must be committed. You must put in the time. You must be able to understand what's going on. And if, by the way, management isn't giving you enough information, you have to go to them and say, "Wait a minute, I don't understand enough. Give me more."
Mm-hmm.
So if there's one thing I would change, there's no question, it would be this idea of commitment.
Great. So where can the audience find you? I know you have a current consulting practice, and
Yes.
maybe give us your website and some information about where we can find you.
Sure. Our website is sagepartners.net, and my personal email address is tdoorley@sagepartners.net. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a podcast called Focus on Growth, Sage Insights. There's always to connect. And I like these sorts of conversations, Lisa, because I reach out to folks who perhaps I might have bumped into normally. I appreciate what it is you've done here and give me a chance to sort of talk about what I see going on in our world.
Great. Well, I appreciate you coming on. A lot of good information that you are able to provide the audience. I think it's going to be really powerful information. So that's it for today's episode of M&A Plus, The Art After the Deal. Huge thanks to Tom Doorley for joining us and sharing his experience and wisdom and everything from scaling with purpose to making boards more than just a formality. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode. And don't forget, value isn't created at the deal table, it's forged in the execution. Check out my book, M&A Plus, available on Amazon, and my website, intoedge.com, for more resources. Until next time, I'm Lisa Scott. Keep creating, keep leading, and keep mastering the art after the deal. Bye for now.